The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
It's the Best Birth Podcast, where we interview experts that elevate you as you prepare your heart and mind to have the best birth.
Each episode will interview professionals so you are prepared for pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. Our experts will build your confidence and empower you to trust your intuition throughout your pregnancy.
This audio is taken from videos on YouTube. Watch the entire episodes on YouTube at Birth Made Mindful. You're listening to the Best Birth Podcast. Today we're so excited for our episode. We have Laurel Bandy, and we'll be talking all about maternity leave and how to prepare for balancing motherhood and career.
Laurel is the mom of two neurodivergent boys. She is a diplomat currently residing in Amsterdam, has had two natural unmedicated births, and is the principal investigator for the City and County of Denver's Paid Family Leave Grant in 2017. This important research contributed to the body of evidence supporting paid leave concurrent with FMLA, caregiving, illness, and babies. Studied leave data from the City and County of Denver's employees from 2014 to 2006, women were taking shorter maternity leaves, 6.5 weeks in 2016 on average, presumably due to lack of pay. On average, if a new parent wanted to stay home for 12 weeks with their new baby, they would have nearly 8 weeks of unpaid time. Surveyed 100 employers to find out what is prevailing. Over 50% provided paid family leave, and the average was 35 days. City and County of Denver has since adopted a 40-day paid care bank for all employees, and the state of Colorado has passed the FMALI Family Insurance Program. Paid family leave is critical to better health outcomes for mom and baby and has the potential to massively improve health equity. It should not depend on where you work or where you live. We must keep pushing for a federal solution. I love your passion here, and thank you for all of that information. That's a great foundation for our interview today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, we'd love to start the conversation by talking about maternity leave and just maybe why is maternity leave such an important topic?
Right. So I think as Jen stated in my bio, maternity leave is presumed to be about 12 weeks in the United States maximum. And that is the time where moms can recover from childbirth, whether natural delivery or cesarean section, and bond with their babies. We also might talk about this more broadly as parental leave, which would include dads, new dads, and adoptive parents. And the law in our country really varies by where you live because we don't, as Jen mentioned, have a federal program. So this is a critical time where mom and baby need to spend a lot of time together, bonding, creating those chemical hormonal bonds, allowing mom to recover, and yeah. So I think we're here to talk today about how to best plan for that time.
The 12 weeks have come up, and that seems to be more of like the longer end of maternal or paternity leave. Tell us a little bit about how the number of weeks is affected by your employer and by your state.
That's a great question. So in the United States, there is a law called FMLA, and this is the Federal Medical Leave Act that provides for 12 weeks of job protection for some, but not all, workers. And the way that our law works, they've bunched maternity leave in with illness and caregiving leave. And I can contrast that to other countries like the Netherlands, where I am now, who are aghast that we would consider recovering from pregnancy a disability. It's just simply not considered that way. But in any case, in our context in the U.S., 12 weeks is the maximum amount of time where you could step away from your job and take some time to bond with your baby after you have when you have a newborn. And you may or may not be able to take those 12 weeks depending on how much you can pay for. That's where the personal preparation comes in. So 12 weeks is kind of the max. And again, that only applies to certain workers. So FMLA is required for employers if they have over 50 employees, or if you work for a government employer like a county or a school district. It does not cover the majority of people who work for small businesses, for example. So that's kind of where the 12 weeks comes from.
Wow. What was your experience with maternity leave? Were you working at the time or stay at home?
I have worked, with the exception of 1 month between jobs, I have worked the entire time I've been a mom. And I was able to take 12 weeks of maternity leave. I was working for the city and county of Denver when I had both of my children. So they're covered under FMLA and because they're a public employer. And there was no paid program except for short-term disability. And this is kind of getting into like how to prepare, but in my case, my employer automatically enrolled me because of my hire date, so it's very circumstantial, automatically enrolled me in a short-term disability program which provided 70% of salary for 6 weeks with a 2-week waiting period. So that means 70% of salary for 4 weeks. So for my first child, I burned through all of my my vacation time. Then I had 70% of pay for 4 weeks. And then I counted on the generosity of other people who donated leave to me. My husband and I at the time worked out how little I could earn per paycheck in order to meet our expenses. We had family members who contributed to pay our rent during those 3 months so that we were able to make it. And I think my story is not uncommon. My second maternity leave was something similar. And again, this is where I'm very passionate that how much time you should have to bond with your baby should not matter based on where you live, where you work, who donates leave, whether or not your employer has short-term disability. It's just simply not equitable.
I was a teacher when I gave birth to my first, and fortunately, his birth was at the end of May, so I did have the summer, but again, that was kind of just luck.
Well, tell us a little bit about preparing for maternity leave. You mentioned that each employer is going to have their own policies. There are some in the United States that are offering more generous amounts of time off, but for most of us, we do need to start preparing maybe even before we consider having a baby. Can you walk us through preparation?
Sure, absolutely. So this is probably a good time to mention that there are 21 states currently that offer some kind of paid maternity leave program. 21 states, 8 of those have voluntary programs, and the rest have, plus Washington, D.C., have mandatory programs. That means that either you or your employer, if you're employed, are paying into some kind of a bank, usually like an insurance type program at the state level that you can tap into. And I believe that the majority of those don't pay 100% salary, but at least there's something that you can count on. So depending on where you live, you want to find out if your state offers either a mandatory or a voluntary program, and then determine how much that pays, what the application process looks like, and all those details. So that's at the state level. Then at the employer level, you can find out, does your employer offer something? And I will say that in the late 20-teens, a lot of municipalities enacted laws for locally employed staff for paid family leave programs. That was part of the research that I did. So depending on, again, where you live, where you work, you want to talk to your HR section and find out what is available to me. And hopefully there will be something, whether it's, again, short-term disability, or you can use your sick leave, or you might be able to use a separate leave bank that your employer has. I just want to flag that if you have not worked for your employer already for 12 months, even if your employer is big enough to offer job protection under FMLA, you likely will not qualify, because FMLA says you have to have been in your job for 12 months before you can get those benefits. So it might be too late for some of you who have just started a new job and found out you're pregnant, but if you are considering family planning, maybe hold off a month or two after you start a new job so that you can take advantage of that job protection and any concurrent paid benefits.
That's such great advice. I also want to note out when you talked about communicating with your HR department, is there any sort of benefit from talking to them when you are in the family planning stages versus when you are announcing your pregnancy? Or I think for some of us, we try to hide a pregnancy from our employer with the hopes that it won't like diminish any sort of promotions or have a lasting effect upon our performance and our jobs. So can you tell us a little bit about the timing? When should we talk to our HR department?
Sure. So certainly I think you can ask your HR department before you're pregnant what types of programs are available. That's a great thing to do. Then you can do what you need to do to plan. And I know that some employers, like Jen, for example, when you're teaching, there is kind of a culture of, if you're going to have a baby, wait till the summer so we don't have to get a sub or whatever. That is not legal. Your employer should not be putting pressure on you to not take maternity leave in the middle of a school year. But that's something to just keep in mind about your employer's culture as you're starting those conversations, and be prepared maybe to hear some of those off-color comments and you wonder, are you supposed to say that? And the answer is no, but it happens. Once you're pregnant, it's really a personal choice as to when you would inform your employer. I would say most people will wait until they know the pregnancy is viable, and even until they start showing, maybe end of first trimester. But it's really up to you. In my case, I was really sick, especially with my first one, and so I had to tell my boss sooner rather than later because I needed some flexibility, maybe to come in a little bit late or, to abruptly leave meetings, to, run down the hall to the bathroom, right? So it really just depends on your personal situation and also your relationship with your boss. But rule of thumb, you don't have to share the news until you're ready. When you're thinking about planning, though, with HR for how much maternity leave you will take and how much of that will be paid, employers typically have deadlines, so you have to apply for FMLA within a certain amount of time before you actually go on leave. And employers will often work with you on starting your paperwork so that they can click submit the second you go into labor, or 2 weeks before your due date or something along those lines. So you don't want to wait too long. You want to have had the conversations with your HR department about, and payroll, how many days are going to be leave without pay, which days, how many hours are going to be annual leave, sick leave, etc. So there is some sort of technical planning that needs to take place before you leave.
And in the case of unfair treatment or dismissal, how can we protect ourselves or deal with that?
Well, if your employer isn't covered under FMLA, your job is not protected. So I think that's another potential thing to look out for when you're job hunting. Although small businesses are often wonderful employers, they also, if they have less than 50 employees, don't protect you. And that also extends to having an illness like cancer or needing to take time off to care for your parents or whatever your case may be. But certainly if you feel mistreated, your employer should have some sort of program where you can allege harassment or discrimination. And if not, then you can contact a lawyer, you can contact your state's Department of Labor and see what can be done.
So I remember reading there is a law that protects you if your job isn't suitable during a pregnancy. So like, let's say you're not able to perform your job functions. Is that also only accessible if that employer has the FMLA policy?
That's a really good question, and one I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Well, talking a lot about maternity leave in the employer setting, let's move to how we can prepare to return back to work after maternity leave.
Okay. Well, I think one way to prepare yourself to return to work is preparing to leave. So what I mean about that is make sure that you have a plan when you leave the office to wrap up loose ends, hand over your work to someone so that you don't come back to an avalanche of work that's been piling up for 3 months. So make sure that you have coverage during your maternity leave. Make sure that your clients or your customers or your colleagues know who to contact, so that you're not getting phone calls while you're on maternity leave, and you can just relax and enjoy your time with your baby. Now, when you do come back, most employers will give you the 12 weeks or however many weeks you're entitled to, and then you're expected to come back full time. However, I think the workplace is evolving now, and there may be some additional options that you can consider. And depending on your employer, these may or may not work. So just going to kind of brainstorm some ideas that may work for you. The first is, can you ratchet up? So can you start maybe going back to work 2 days a week, and then 3 days a week, and 4 days a week, and so on until you're back to full time? I've heard of a lot of moms who've been successful in negotiating that with their employers. You still have to figure out how to pay yourself for those days that you have off, and if you've already burned through all of your leave, that may or may not be an option depending on your financial situation. Another one is flexible work hours. So when you have a baby and you're going back to work, you're going to have childcare, and that may be very close to your home, or you might have to drive 30 minutes or an hour or whatever you need to do. So talk to your employer and see if there might be some flexibility in the work hours. Some employers also, by the way, offer breaks throughout the day for nursing, where you could go to the childcare location, nurse your child, and come back to work. So that might be an option to consider. And on that note, moms are allowed to pump at work. You need to have a space that's not a bathroom. So definitely ask your HR about that also before you return to work, so you're mentally prepared about what that space will look like, where to find it, how to schedule it in case you are, sharing that room with other moms. Some other ideas, job sharing. Maybe there's another person in your office who's looking for more flexibility or less work, and perhaps you could arrange a job share where each of you works 50% or whatever percentage is working for both. Teleworking's been big since the pandemic, so make sure to ask about that as an option. Maybe it's not full-time telework, but that certainly helps reduce your commute time and increase time with baby. Another option might be to bring your baby to work, especially for nursing mothers. That's been a more progressive policy that some employers have adopted, and I think that works especially well for small businesses. So maybe if you don't have that full 12 weeks because you're not under FMLA, maybe you can bring baby to work. Another option that Sarah and I were talking about prior to filming the podcast is intermittent leave versus continuous leave. You can take maternity leave continuously, meaning you start when the baby's born and you end 3 months later, or you might be able to work with your employer to say, I'd really like to just take a month up front and then I'll come back to work for a month because maybe my spouse will have that month off, and then I'll do my next 2 months. So that way you're sort of stretching out the time baby has a parent at home with them, even if it's not you, the mother, the whole time. We've already talked about donated leave and leave without pay. So those are some ideas. I don't know if either of you have heard of other best practices or new ideas that people have used to stretch their time as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And there are a lot of flexible employers who will allow you to, like you said, come back a little bit earlier than those 12 weeks, or maybe it's even, 4 months at some generous employers. So you're able to kind of work back in a little bit more slowly, or like you said, do a partnership with your spouse or your partner who might also have some leave. And so you could potentially, if you had 4 months at each of your jobs, you could have 8 months of coverage for that baby who then gets that parent supporting them in the days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting to note that while there are some protocols or systems in place, they aren't always best suited for you and baby. I remember, again, going back into the school year after having baby and having to pump. Well, I pumped in my classroom during lunch, and that was interesting. I had the blinds closed, but it was still recess, and there would be occasionally students knocking on the door, and I would just have to ignore it. And there was a place set up for nursing, but it was all the way across the school, and with lunch being so short, it's tricky. So there are things in place, but they may not be ideal too. So just getting creative or, figuring out those things beforehand, like you said, so you are mentally prepared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was sharing with Sarah that I used to pump in the car on my 45-minute commute, which I'm not recommending to our listeners because clearly that is maybe a safety problem, but that's what I had to do. So I think there is an element of you've got to figure it out. But it certainly helps to be prepared and to be savvy about our rights, which is to say that they can't Your employer can't say, well, you can use the bathroom. No, they have to provide you a sink so you can wash out your pumping supplies and so forth.
Well, and let's talk a little bit more about pumping at work. Recently, there are some laws and rights that protect you as a pumping person. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that has come into play?
Sure. So I don't know that there have been any laws passed necessarily, but there's been a lot more enforcement of existing laws, and employers adopting new policies to comply with the laws. This also extends to students. So students are protected also under FMLA, students and athletes, and universities, employers, they all have to provide these facilities for us to use. And then really it's a matter of working with your supervisor to figure out, okay, during the day I need X amount of time, maybe 3 times a day. And as baby gets older, maybe that drops down to 2 times a day. But something that worked well for me was to literally schedule it on my Outlook calendar, just block off the time, so that I would know, okay, I'm going to get up now, I'm going to go do it so I don't get caught up in the day and miss my pumping hour. Because you're entitled to it, but you do have to sort of take some ownership of taking advantage of that time.
Oh, that's such great advice, to actually put it in your schedule so that you're not then overloaded with work obligations that could interfere.
Yeah, and if someone wants to invite you for a meeting, they see that you're busy already, and that sort of heads off oh shoot, I was supposed to go pump and now I'm supposed to go to this meeting, and that way your employer knows, yep, that time is protected, and they certainly don't want to ask you to forego that time.
One new tool that might come into play for some of our listeners would be wearable pumps or hands-free pumps. I personally haven't used them, and so I don't know if it is something that you're able to utilize in conversation with somebody else. I know my personal pump is very loud, and so I don't know if the hands-free pumps are a better solution, but that's one option that a lot of people are, using wearable hands-free pumps that are supposed to be concealed and less interruptive.
I have a friend who recently gave birth to twins, and she has been pumping at around the same time that she feeds her baby, and hers was very non-invasive, and just, I could hardly even tell that she was pumping while we were conversing. So that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and some employers also provide pumps. So again, another question to ask, rather than lugging your pump back and forth, there may be one there, and you just need to bring your own equipment, like the attachments. And on that note, a lot of healthcare plans cover pumps, so be sure to check into that if you plan to pump.
Yeah, you can go onto your insurance's website, and oftentimes they will have an application where you apply for your pump. They'll have options where you can choose, and even upgrades if you want to select something that is not just one of the basic pumps. Although the basic pumps have a lot of success as well. They're awesome.
Yeah, I would say on that note too, consider bringing it to the hospital when you give birth as well. A lot of hospitals have pumps, but if you want to use your own, then you could bring it to the hospital too, just so you're prepared.
Is there anything else that you want to share in regards to pumping at work?
I don't think so. But I did want to go back to something Jen mentioned with regards to inequity in the workplace and maternity leave. And we had talked a little bit about the wage gap, right? So part of the calculus for any woman considering maternity leave is, am I going to stay in the workforce or am I not? And it is a real thing. There have been multiple studies that have shown that there is a wage gap, and it usually starts around maternity leave. It already starts in a lot of settings because women are often given lower salary offers than men, but let's assume that you start at the same time as a qualified man, you have the same qualifications, you go on maternity leave, and that wage gap can literally be quantified to the day. So that is a real thing. And we choose to go on maternity leave and stay in the workforce for other reasons than a wage gap, but that's just something that I want to acknowledge that is indeed real, and unfortunate, but it is a thing. On the other hand, there are also studies that show that if you exit the workforce there is a longer term financial deficit for you because you're not accruing your 401k. You're out of the workplace. It's sometimes more difficult to re-enter the workplace at the same level, and it sort of interrupts your career. So there are a lot of things to consider, a lot of factors to consider when you have a baby, and are you going to keep working or aren't you? So just wanted to put that on the table.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic to remember that not all situations will unfold the way that you intend. You know, you might have to jump back into the workplace after you thought that you could, take some time off. You may want to. You may have children that are hard to manage day to day, and so you want to be back there, like having that fulfillment, working, contributing. And so that I think that it's important to realize that we can alter our plans. We can make changes, and with the information that we have prior to having our first baby, there's so many different options. And like you said, there's so many remote jobs, different things we can do, lots of different side hustles or work from home opportunities, but also people who decide that this is a great time to kind of jump into something new. I want to try my hand at a new skill or craft, or, just take a new job. And I think all of those things are really important to accept within ourselves and realize that it might take place, and that's great. That's a wonderful transformation as part of our journey in motherhood.
Mm-hmm. I love that you speak to how it's not a one size fits all either. There's lots of room for adaptation within that, and I just always love releasing shame and comparison that what you want to do may not be something that someone else wants to do, and you don't have to feel like you need to go back to the workforce if that's what's best for you, or if you really want to. There's no judgment there either. So just a place for all sizes.
The topic also brings in childcare. I feel like a lot of times if you have reliable, great, trusted childcare, it's a lot easier to pursue the full-time career or the part-time job. Do you have any experiences that you'd like to share, or any of the, kind of your research with childcare and how we can work towards solutions there?
Sure. So I think it's generally accepted that in the United States, childcare is exorbitantly expensive. And we also have underqualification of childcare providers. It's not really a job that people are actively pursuing because it pays little. It pays little for the providers. It's expensive for those of us who are paying for it, and it's a very difficult job. So that said, from the maternity leave context, my advice would be think about childcare early. And as you said, Sarah, that can really feed into your decision about what you're going to do. A lot of places have wait lists for new children, and sometimes you can get on the wait list while you're pregnant. Sometimes you have to wait until baby's born. It just depends on the childcare facility. So don't be shy about calling around, getting a tour, and talking to people who have recent experience with those facilities. A lot of people these days are trying nanny shares, which can work well if you have a neighbor who maybe had a baby or a good friend, and you live close enough to each other that can work. In-home daycare can be a great option. You just want to make sure that they are licensed, and then that the provider is properly trained in CPR, and any sort of early childhood certificates are definitely a bonus. For me personally, I had both in-home daycare. I had my mom who provided daycare, my father-in-law, and then I also have experience with larger daycare centers. And I think, if I could do it all over again, it would have been great to just take a few years off and be with my kids, but that wasn't financially an option for my family, and I don't regret staying in the workforce. I would say that the in-home daycares provided certainly more personalized care, but they also don't have the flexibility to scale up. So if you're using an in-home daycare provider and they call out sick, that's it. Then either you're calling out sick or you're calling up your mother-in-law to say, please help me, and figure something out. Whereas in a larger facility, often they can, they can sub somebody in or figure that out. They're not going to close the whole classroom because one teacher is sick. So it really just depends, again, on your personal situation, and I don't think there's really any right answer. But those are some of the things that I would think about.
The conversation is illuminating because there's many right answers. And also in our role as mothers, we have to have backup plans. And I love that Jen has a whole network of people that are able to, like swap off with babysitting kids, or, just like have your own list of people who might be available. There's certifications online. So, care.com and some other kind of like last minute options for childcare. And just having those tools in your pocket where it's like, I know exactly where I can go, that is going to relieve a lot of the stress and pressure so that you don't find yourself in a bind time and time again.
For the moms who are stay-at-home or, part-time, an option that I found is I send my boys to daycare once a week. And I don't really have a justifiable reason, so to speak, to send them there, but it's just a reprieve for me. And, I am very blessed that I have the means to do that, and that I found a place that could accommodate it. But it started from a desire to say, hey, I want a little bit more balance in my life. And so I began seeking out. I called 5 or 6 places. Do you care for children less than full time, or just one day a week? And yeah, just exploring your options, keeping the possibilities open, and doing your research and educating.
Laurel, is there anything else that you'd like to share for childcare?
I think something else worth mentioning, and as Jen said in my bio, both of my children are neurodivergent. And for one of them, it became apparent even as a 12-month-old that he was developmentally a little bit different from his peers. So, if you are noticing early on that your child seems to be developing differently, I would encourage you, first of all, to talk to your pediatrician and get evaluations as soon as possible. The sooner the better. But for most moms of neurodivergent kids who I've spoken with, in-home daycare or smaller daycare centers is a much better option than a large daycare center where your child really needs to kind of fit the mold in order for them to make the classroom work. Same thing goes for schools down the road, but just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of your listeners may deal with that as diagnoses go up across the country.
Thank you so much. That's important to recognize that the needs of your child may be different depending upon what type of childcare is available. Well, we love to share resources on the podcast. Do you have any books or experts that you look to when it comes to anything regarding motherhood and pregnancy?
Sure. So I swear by Ina Mae Gaskin. She's a midwife and is really well known for educating women and advocating for natural childbirths. So when I was pregnant for the first time, I realized that I was holding my breath when I was thinking about childbirth. And I thought, okay, this is obviously I'm like panicking about this a little bit because I don't know how it's going to go. The women in my family, most of them had natural childbirths, but it sounded a little bit traumatic. There was like some forceps involved, some of the births. And so at any rate, I thought, okay, I need to educate myself and just be able to breathe as I'm envisioning this process that's going to happen in, a couple of months. So I started reading Ina Mae Gaskin, and I also read a book on hypnobirthing, which I know, Sarah, you have read that as well. But Ina Mae just does a fantastic job of giving you positive birth stories. I think we can all relate that when you share that you're pregnant or if you're visibly pregnant, you often hear well-meaning people say, well, when I was pregnant, this catastrophe happened, or it was so painful, or thank goodness I had an epidural. And instead, Ina Mae Gaskin gives you half of a book full of positive stories about how women are able to manage the discomfort and, yes, pain sometimes of labor and child delivery. And that gives you confidence. It builds your confidence. And then the other half of her book talks about the mechanics. So when you're going through that yourself, you understand, okay, this is productive and this is going to end and this is helping me get to the end. So that was really helpful for me. And the other one I love is Penelope Leach. She's a British child development specialist, and she has a book called Your Baby and Child. They have not issued one very recently, but you can still find it on Amazon. It just takes you through the developmental stages from birth through, I think, about age 6. And that was kind of my Bible for child development. I found that I got overwhelmed if I Googled things, but my mom would often remind me, well, what does Penelope say? And I'd go look in the book and I go, okay, well, this is normal, or this is what I should be expecting around this age. So those are 2 that I would recommend.
So great. Every week we share a Mom Squad secret, and this week it's from Danielle, and it goes right along with what you were talking about with Ina May's guide about pain. And she said, remember the acronym for pain: P, purposeful; A, anticipated; I, intermittent; N, normal. And I would just add, I've heard the acronym too for HOPE: hold on, pain ends. And that's great to remember with childbirth. Like it will end.
If you'd like to share a Mom Squad secret, we'll link to our Facebook group in the show notes. We'll also link to those books that Laurel shared. Laurel, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a privilege to talk with you.
Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. We hope you've been elevated and inspired by this week's expert.
Subscribe today so you never miss an episode. And please share our podcast or post on your social media so that other moms and dads-to-be can also have the best birth.
Please note that the information provided is based on the expert's insights and personal experience. It is not intended as medical guidance. Please seek the advice of your medical provider as it applies to your specific condition.